Thanks for coming to this decoder. What I'd like to do with my time is to set the stage for a discussion of New Orleans and Claiborne Avenue by talking about what redlining and urban renewal and urban highways look like in our 3D tax models and how we see the impacts in economic terms. There we go. So when I speak about this topic, the thing that always comes to mind to me is the American chestnut in the Appalachian forest. And the reason for that is, if you don't know this story, you could go, a person could go to a forest in the Appalachians, even an old growth forest like this, and think, this is what nature must have been like for thousands of years. This is a natural forest as it was meant to be. But what you don't see, what very few living people have ever seen, is that the dominant tree in that forest was the American chestnut. And in the beginning of the 20th century, ironically enough, the American chestnut caught a blight that it couldn't resist. And over the course of the next 50 years, basically all of them died. And so about a third of the trees, I'm told, are missing from the Appalachian forest. And so the point that I'm making here is that when we look at our American cities, even when they've been rebuilt and revitalized and bounced back somewhat from urban renewal, there are still these major scars that are left. And there's a lot of our city that's just gone, that our heritage has been taken from us. And so this is an example of that, the Cross Bronx Expressway. And to put that in terms of the attitude towards the cities when this was being done, here's one of those visceral quotes from Robert Moses, who describes it as hacking your way through with a meat axe. And I think that's a pretty fitting description of what was done. So let's look at what a meat axe can do to a city. This is a 3D model of tax model of Ramsey County, where St. Paul is. And what I'm going to tell you about is a presentation I got to do supporting an intervention to try to repair some of this damage. So if you're tuning into Urban 3 Decoder, I'm guessing you've probably seen these before and have a pretty good understanding of what we're looking at here, but I'll try to give the briefest explanation ever, which is this, that what we're looking at is property tax value per acre. Higher is more efficient. And basically, this is every property in a community. And what we find when we look at this pattern is that the more dense things are, the better designed, the more stuff basically you put on the same amount of land, the more revenue it generates for the city. And so, we get a sense from that of what creates the big purple spike and what accounts for the lower lying background radiation of a city, sort of the background of single family housing, basically. The other thing that really stands out as very notable in this model is you see some real big disparities between different neighborhoods, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as I said, the focus of this presentation is the effort to build a land bridge over the interstate in a formerly redline neighborhood in St. Paul called the Rondo neighborhood. And so this was the first time I'd heard this term of restorative development, which is an initiative that's coming from the leadership of good old Mayor Pete here. There he is, it's hard hat, and presumably building a highway by himself. When I think of this term, restorative development, it makes me think of restorative dentistry. And so in the same way that when a person is missing a tooth, you can use the remaining teeth to support a replacement. We take the same idea, and in our cities, we have intact neighborhood and then gaps. And so the idea is to fill the gap with a land bridge and then create the opportunity to rebuild the commercial core and create value in a neighborhood. And so this is what it looks like. This is the land bridge that they want to build and the way it's going to reconnect this neighborhood. So I'm going to take a little closer look at what this looks like in the data. So here's a closer view of St. Paul. You can see downtown there. And there's basically the gap running right through the middle, Interstate 94. That's what we're talking about replacing. And so, when we talk about the history of urban highways and urban renewal, it has its foundation in redlining. And really, redlining is just a really convenient symbol for a whole constellation of racist policies, both based on a map or based on who people were, that excluded people from opportunity and made it very difficult for people in certain neighborhoods to live life and prosper. And so when we look at that redlining map in terms of our data, one of the things that stands out is you can see the extent to which not only are things redlined, but also a lot of the city's just missing now. You can see really like how the highway cuts off neighborhoods from each other and neighborhoods from downtown and downtown from the capital. If you're not that familiar with redlining or this data, I would encourage you to go to Mapping Inequality website, where you can look through these maps and start to see how they relate to how our cities look today and read that sort of hateful language that was put into these things. And so today we know that those maps correlate with outcomes in terms of concentration of poverty and racial segregation. And you can see too how it looks as though someone has taken an eraser and dragged it through this map, separating communities from each other. And so I want to talk a little bit about the mechanism by which redlining destroyed wealth. In the normal functioning financial system, a property owner is able to have access to capital, borrow money, to buy and sell their property, make improvements, basically do all of the things that maintain a property's value and allow it to appreciate in value. And so, and be able to continue paying taxes and utilities to support the government and make it have the resources to provide services. In a redline neighborhood, people were excluded from that system. And so without access to loans or insurance or those financial resources, it's much more difficult to do those things. And this destructive cycle sets in of decay, tax delinquency, eventually foreclosure and vacancy, where what was a tax producing asset for a city becomes a costly liability. And so writ large, neighborhood by neighborhood, some places get investment, some places do not, and we start to see a wider and wider divergence between neighborhoods. And of course, when the decisions start to be made for where we're going to tear things down to build highways, the natural choice is the cheapest, most degraded or disinvested part of the community. And so, which is to say, right through the redline neighborhoods. So here's the value per acre model that we've symbolized by, the redlining map. You can start to see the disparities in the value per acre between neighborhoods. So here's the Rondo neighborhood as it is today. You can see downtown's off to the right. The Capitol is in the top right corner. And this is the footprint of the highway. This is all property that has been taken out of the private property system and is now just right of way. And this is what it looked like before that happened. So everything here was demolished. And one of the things that stands out is you can see how intact the urban fabric is, how it just looks like seamless neighborhood. This was also the commercial core of this neighborhood. So a lot of the thriving and prospering Black businesses in this area were destroyed, so we got a double effect of the highway physically taking property and wealth from people, also destroying the commercial center, also disconnecting the neighborhood. And there's also the highway itself, and what we know now is a very detrimental health impact. And so the highway was pulled right through the middle of the neighborhood. And when we look at the tax model, we can see there's a big difference in what the values look like to the south, which is kind of upside down from convention. South is up in this map. And so sure enough, that correlates with the redlining maps, where the areas that were redlined or didn't have access to capital have a lower value per acre on average. And so, and you can see right through the middle of Rondo, the parcels are just missing. This is what it used to look like, what used to be under there. And so I'm gonna do a trick, see if you notice it. Because I whenever I see this, I can't stand to leave things that way. So I got in my time machine, went back in time, and I kept that highway from being built. Brought Amy with me to help. What I really did is this thought experiment to see what might have this been worth had the highway not been built. So when I dropped this back in there, I hope you didn't notice just at first, but because it really looks seamless. It looks like a more natural city this way. But if we want to get an idea of what this might have been worth, it depends on what we pull from. So if we compare to the neighborhoods just right around it, it might have been worth as much as $70 million. The thing to keep in mind is those neighborhoods experience redlining and experience the noxious effect of being next to a highway. So maybe it would be better to compare it to the neighborhoods to the north. And let's assume too that when we get in our time machine, we'll also undo redlining. Everything's green line now. But even then, what I think is really interesting is if we look to the north a little bit, University Avenue has a transit-oriented development and it has a transit line. So it makes me wonder if instead of building that highway, what if we put a transit line there? Maybe it'd be worth $300 million. So what we're starting to get a sense of, and we have no idea what might have happened, but somewhere between 70 and $300 million might have been the value for just this stretch of the highway. Well, here's the other thing to consider. One of the really compelling things that Reconnecting Rondo put together is this report about trying to quantify the compounded effect of that, because in addition to producing property tax for the city, that's also represents family wealth, which could have been accumulated and passed on through generations. And so we have this, lasting effect of missing wealth today. And so keeping in mind how much value has been lost, I don't think it's such a tall order to invest in reconnecting these communities and trying to undo some of this damage that was done both economically and in human terms to these neighborhoods. And the other thing that I want to leave us with is the idea this isn't something that's unique to St. Paul or New Orleans or any city in particular in America. This is endemic to American cities. And I just want us to all think about how many billions of dollars were erased by building urban highways, and how many billions of dollars are possible to reclaim by tearing them down. And so with that, I bring us to, I don't have a 3D model of New Orleans yet, but we do have this figured ground, and I'll leave us with this image of New Orleans, and hopefully that provides a good springboard for Amy to talk about the Claiborne Expressway.
All right, here we are. Actually, when I pulled this up, Josh said I got the ugliest picture that I could of the highway, and it's one of the many ugly pictures that I have of the highway. This happens to be in the 7th Ward, and it actually shows the devastation that highways can do in residential communities. People look at this every day when they come out of their homes, and I think it is deplorable and definitely not a way to live. Certainly, this is not a good quality of life for anyone. Okay. So who is the Claiborne Alliance? We started off as a coalition founded in 2017 in response to the city's plan to actually build a container village under the highway. You can see the group of people here. Here we are in front of Senator Bill Cassidy's office in DC in 2019. We went to DC to lobby on behalf of the passage of the infrastructure bill, and much to our surprise, the Louisiana delegation was in favor of the bill. I thought we would get a lot of pushback from the more conservatives, but we didn't. They were actually quite welcoming. In the bottom right, what's to my right, you can see our first bit of advocacy where we actually plastered posters on the highway to actually bring an awareness to what was lost. And you'll see some of what was lost, to the conditions that we're facing now, and also, what might we look like in the future. And it stimulated a lot of different reactions. In some cases, folks responded more horribly to the poster that looked at existing conditions. And in other parts of the neighborhood, they responded very horribly to the look at the future. And I think that is because I used pictures of folks that I saw on the street and they did not like it. They were in the public right away, but I turned them into heroes in my mind. In theirs, it apparently wasn't that way, because I can't imagine us not supporting a look to the future. But what it does indicate, aside from folks saying, well, you shouldn't have used my picture. That's a big thing in New Orleans because we're photographed a lot on the street and we are in public. But it also speaks to folks' fear about gentrification when the highway is removed. So that's definitely something we have to work on. Most recently, I founded the Design Studio, which is a community-based, not-for-profit design studio that's committed to making land use accessible to all. One thing I've found in my practice is that people of color, poor people, elderly people, quite often don't understand the language of land use. They don't participate, they're not invited to participate. And I think we need to open those doors, because we as planners and designers make decisions about people's future that impact them for 50 years, and they need to be at the table. Excuse me. So the goal of the studio is to actually make land use accessible. And this is a picture of the Claiborne corridor. It runs from parish line to parish line. So it stretches from Jefferson Parish on the western side to St. Bernard Parish on the eastern side. I call Claiborne the spine of New Orleans. Josh's analogy to the tooth, the dentures, our teeth, whatever, bring to mind my analogy of the Claiborne as a spine. And when your back hurts, if there's anything wrong with your back, you can't function. So the I-10 corridor is the sore in the spine of New Orleans. So we've got to fix that. Here's a red line map of New Orleans, and you can see that this is the Claiborne Avenue corridor. I've highlighted the footprint of the highway in black. It went right through a really vibrant commercial district, again, through a neighborhood of color. But you can see once you get up into the 7th Ward, which is solidly residential, it just devastates. It just cuts diagonally across what was a solid residential neighborhood. And the 7th Ward traditionally was the home of the craftsmen, musicians also, but when I was growing up, that's where the brick masons lived and the finished carpenters, and everybody who made New Orleans look like New Orleans lived in the 7th Ward. There was a lot of pride from the people who were born and raised in the 7th Ward. My dad is from there. Here's Claiborne before its destruction of the historic core. You can see it was quite beautiful, quite a tree-lined avenue. On the left, our beloved St. Bernard Circle. Everybody who remembers Claiborne wants that circle back. Even people who have only known the highway, when they see pictures of the Claiborne, the St. Bernard Avenue Circle, they want that element back. And I think we need to give it back to the city and the community. On the right, you can see the devastation of the oak trees. The government came in on Ash Wednesday in 1966 and began bulldozing the trees. The folks in the neighborhood were horrified. For those of you who know New Orleans well, Ash Wednesday is a high holy holiday here. So to violate the city in that way, it has been a devastation that folks have not forgotten. Uh, the highway also just devastated the residential fabric. This is actually, the slide on the left is actually in downtown New Orleans. One of my colleagues' families is from here, and he talks about the third ward all the time. We take pride in our wards here. Not only are they voting districts, but they're neighborhoods. But it's really ironic, the photo on the right of the homeless camp is taken right across the street from where all the residential properties were. So I think it's ironic that we eliminated great housing stock, great historic housing stock, and actually it's been replaced by homeless tents. The city has since fenced under this portion of the highway in the CBD because we can't have the homeless tents around the tourist. So the homeless have migrated east into Treme, and they're, going farther and farther east into the 7th Ward. So we've got to look for a solution that houses people. We can't keep pushing them out by fencing under the interstate. Sorry. This is a picture of the 7th Ward. It is very typical of what you might have seen in the area where the highway just was rammed through. Again, this is a picture of the 7th Ward. It is not far from the first picture that I showed you, but it amazes me how close these people have to live to the highway. And several people think housing is a choice. But when you don't have a lot of money, when you're not able to move, when you're immobile for a lot of reasons, you don't have those choices. A lot of families like mine have been in the corridor since before the highway. We want to keep our property. We don't want to sell our property because of the highway. My family was here first. They've been here almost 70 years. It's the same with people in other parts of the corridor, like the 7th Ward. Maybe they don't want to move and they tolerate it because they want to keep the real estate that they have. We lost quite a few businesses as a result of the highway. The LaBranche drugstore was a favorite in New Orleans. I remember it was actually at another location in the corridor when I was growing up. And eventually it faded away. Businesses in the corridor didn't close automatically, they faded away. And LaBranche was one of those drugstores. It had a beautiful black and white octagonal floor. And it smelled like bubble gum, every child's dream. And I just have fond memories of the aroma and also the architecture of the place, the interior architecture, because it was classic pharmacy. What you see on the right is the same block, the same corner, actually, where LaBranche, this particular photograph of the LaBranche pharmacy was taken. You can see that's gone. The building is still there. So this is one of the buildings we were able to keep, but you can see across the corridor, beyond the columns of the highway, all of the historic structures that you see in the old photo are gone. It's gone. They couldn't withstand the pressure of the highway. But fortunately, the LaBranche building was able to stay. It's in the hands of other people now. And fortunately, a family that has had the courage to invest in the corridor has opened a plant store there. They also have another building on the corridor. So they have faith where many don't, which is great. When we did our prep session, we talked about biases, and there are a lot of biases in New Orleans which contribute to the difficulty in moving this campaign forward. And one of the big ones is that removing the highway, excuse me, sorry, I have a sensitive mouse. Removing the highway will devastate the city economically because there's only one way to get downtown. That is not true. And I get this when I get on the radio. Actually, there's one caller every time I go on to this AM talk show in the morning, and I don't go very often, but I've been on it often enough. The radio producer cues her up. She's always the first caller, and she always chastises me for wanting to remove the highway and attempting to kill the New Orleans economy, because she doesn't understand that the highway is what devastated the economy, not my attempt to remove it, because my attempt to remove it will actually, reverse the economic fate that we've suffered for years now. So this is something we have to educate the public here, to let them understand that this highway is not the economic savior of the city. It is in fact the opposite. New Orleans has quite a unique street grid, and it's very, very interesting. And you can see this is an old shell map. It's always been a favorite of mine, but you can see how we do have a grid, even though when you drive the street, it doesn't appear that way, but it follows the river, which actually gives the city great views. We have beautiful terminated vistas here because the city turns and it curves. So I think we should restore that, and then let people know that there are great ways to travel through the city. I wanted to ask you to take a minute and look at how our boulevards are connected. So New Orleans is a really vibrant city of neighborhoods and boulevards, and the boulevards define the neighborhoods. So on one side of Claiborne is historic Treme, and on the other side, I live on the lakeside. Historic Treme is on the riverside, which means it's south, near the river. I live on the northern edge, which means my house would take you toward the lake, even though I live right on Claiborne. But I live in the 6th Ward, and there's a lot of pride in coming from the 6th Ward. It is part of the greater Treme neighborhood. But when you listen to people and you talk to people who are from New Orleans, if you tell them I'm from 6th Ward, Dumaine, which is where I'm from, I live on Dumaine Street, they know exactly where I live. So I want to give you a minute, ask you to take a minute and look at how our boulevard system works. This is uptown. We're going to go along Louisiana Avenue, which is where my grandparents used to live when they were living. My mom is from uptown. My dad's from downtown. They had a very forbidden marriage, because if you're from downtown, you marry people from downtown. And if you're uptown, you marry from people from uptown. If you're fair-skinned, you marry other fair-skinned people. If you're dark-skinned, then you marry other dark-skinned people. My mom was fair, my dad wasn't. So socially, it was a big deal that my parents got married. My grandfather was highly educated, my maternal grandfather. My paternal grandfather was a junk dealer. So you can imagine the scandal of my parents' happy marriage, which lasted really until the ends of their lives. So here you can see it's beautiful tree-lined Louisiana Avenue. We're about to turn around and then go on to St. Charles. So you can see the boulevards are seamlessly integrated into one another. Claiborne was like this. It was considered the St. Charles of the Black St. Charles of New Orleans, because Claiborne was the home of our Black Wall Street. So here are threats to culture. One of them is tourism, because culture is being promoted for economic gain and it's not preservation. So I point actually to a really popular symbol of the Jazz and Heritage Festival. That symbol was taken from New Orleans second lines, which are a burial tradition. It started as a burial tradition that actually came from Africa. There are similar parades when folks die. That is a tradition that is here. And that symbol is an illustration of it. A lot of folks here call that the pimping of the culture. And what happens is that it becomes commercialized, and folks see that as the death of the culture, and truthfully, to take it a step further, a symbol of gentrification. The unfortunate thing about this is our musicians are wonderful. They need to be celebrated and they need to be paid. But unfortunately, musicians here don't get paid. So they end up doing more tourist-driven things, really for a pittance. Also, with events like this, the residents can't afford to go because we don't pay folks in New Orleans a living wage. So we don't get to enjoy the cultural assets that we've created. So we've got to reverse that by, creating opportunities for folks. Another tourist threat is short-term rentals. And this, more than, culture being used as a symbol to attract tourists, short-term rentals have devastated neighborhoods like Treme and pushed those people who create those cultural assets, who become the illustrations for things like the Jazz Fest. And I don't want to rag on the Jazz Fest because they do wonderful things for our musicians and our culture. You can also see these types of symbols in the grocery store. You go into the local grocery store and there's a 10-foot symbol of Louis Armstrong playing the trumpet. That has nothing to do with the groceries, right? So it's a part of pimping the culture that residents don't like. But the short-term rentals, and understanding folks want to experience the authenticity of our neighborhoods, just devastated the real estate market here. It's artificially driven up the value of properties. But more importantly, it has forced people who work in places like the French Quarter, downtown New Orleans, who really provide service to the business community, our community, the tourist community. It's pushed them out. It's pushed them to New Orleans East and Metairie. So they can't even enjoy their homes anymore. So when we look at the threats to culture, they are far reaching. I will admit, when Maxine first brought this up, the first thing I thought of was the second line culture, because they are always used for illustrations. But when you speak about culture and the loss of culture here, that's usually the first thing the residents go to because you can see it. But the way we live is also something that has been lost, particularly to the highway. Here's a picture from the turn of the last century that shows the beloved promenade on Claiborne. This was Claiborne back around the time my house was built, around 1910. And you can see the trees are young, but folks actually recreated on the open space that was Claiborne Avenue. My grandmother always talked about the promenade. So when we would go downtown, she would, make me get dressed up, because that was a thing in New Orleans, to walk, through the neighborhood and into downtown in your finery. We can't do that on Claiborne anymore because the highway doesn't make the environment conducive to having a promenade. And we need that back. The Port of New Orleans has actually pushed back on the highway in the past because they said it would hinder the operations of their facilities uptown. You can actually see on this map of New Orleans, the circle is approximately where the port facilities are, and they're sandwiched, actually. I'm going to go back. Me and this mouse. Sorry, guys. It's actually sandwiched between Mardi Gras World, which is the tourist industry, and then the recreation facilities in Audubon Park, which is in uptown New Orleans. So the port is squeezed. They can't grow anymore, not in the city. But you can see from this map, they have quite a large jurisdiction. So it's quite a force. They're a major employer, and we do have to listen to them. But they do have some other plans, and that is to relocate to a larger tract of land in Violet, Louisiana. And there's an arrow that points from the purple landmark, purple bubble, to actually a red star. The move would actually bring the Port of New Orleans downriver a bit. So folks who are coming up the river to get to the port wouldn't have to navigate quite as far. They wouldn't have to come into the metropolitan area. But the problem here is that the land that the port wants to develop is environmentally sensitive, and it will wipe out a Black school and relocate it. So the school would be moved from the neighborhood to somewhere else. I don't know exactly where else. But also you would have two neighborhoods, which aren't wealthy neighborhoods, sandwiched between a cold storage facility. So that's not really good either, because you'd have an industrial use right in between two families. The buffer, actually on one side of this tract is a cemetery, and that cemetery is being lifted up as the buffer between the industrial use of the port and the neighborhood. That's arguable, I'll say at this point, as to whether or not it is a sufficient buffer between a neighborhood and an industrial use. This map actually shows the number of ports that we have along the Mississippi, which is right here, if you can see my cursor. So there's quite a bit to navigate. The blue dot on the right side, there's Port Fourchon on the lower left, a yellow dot, which is a service station. Port Fourchon services the oil industry and the oil rigs. The dot to the upper right of it is the Port of Plaquemines, which is actually fairly robust. So there is an opportunity with the Port of Plaquemines to give New Orleans a run for its money, because you can see that, you know, it's becomes more complicated to get there. And also it's not a port that's able to expand. So the move is good for the port, but it doesn't really help Violet in any way. Also, the Port of New Orleans plan is forcing the conversation of building a highway through the 9th Ward. And this is the same 9th Ward that was devastated by Katrina, devastated by Hurricane Betsy back in the 60s. This would be another devastation. And the whole idea is to be able to get trucks to the highway. Well, you can see Highway 47 also leads to Interstate 10. It's actually Interstate 510, which goes directly to 10 and is a more direct route between Violet and the interstate. But there are facilities that the port would probably have access to once it moved to Violet that were once part of the Port of St. Bernard that are actually closer to the lower 9th Ward. So the thinking is that the highway through the 9th Ward would facilitate, you know, port traffic and cargo movement. I have to say that the city of New Orleans is not learning from the mistake of Claiborne if it is going to support the building of another interstate called the Florida Expressway in the 9th Ward. Word of note, this has been on the books with the Louisiana Department of Transportation for quite a long time, and occasionally it rears its ugly head, but now there are two things that are really pushing the conversation forward. One of them is infrastructure money, and the other one is the move of the port. So we've got to advocate that this highway doesn't come in and just double down on the damage that's already been done to the city by the Claiborne Expressway. One thing we can do to actually help facilitate a discussion about things like, you know, highways and highway expansion, because while we want the Claiborne Expressway to go on one hand, we do want it to go. We do need to acknowledge that that could give us an expansion in the 9th Ward, and that's not good. And we're seeing the DOT start to do some horse trading. We'll get rid of one, but we're going to build another. We're seeing this in a couple of other cities. We do need to look at rail. We have quite a robust rail map. So we need to talk about how rail can play a better part in getting cargo out of our ports and then onto the highways into the rest of the country. But we can't continue to do this at the cost of every neighborhood. So I think we have options, but we have to investigate all of them. This is a map of just the port's rail service, and you can see it snakes all the way through New Orleans. Actually, you'll see Jefferson Highway, Harahan, the lower left part of the map. That's Jefferson Parish. So you can see that the port has a rail system that actually snakes through its jurisdictions. So I think we need to really talk about what we can do. We are looking at highway expansions around the state. We are banding together as a statewide community to actually talk about undoing the harm and stopping the threat. So New Orleans is ground zero because we have an example of what this devastation looks like. But unfortunately, our highway department is talking about doing the same thing in Lafayette and then the same thing in Shreveport. So we've all banded together, started by me searching for like-minded individuals around the state on the internet. And I found Allendale and Shreveport on Facebook, and then the rest is history. We talked about other cities that are facing similar threats, and it's not only highways, but stroads. Monroe has issues with stroads. So we meet monthly, actually once a month, to discuss the highway planned expansions, removal of Claiborne, how we can begin to educate folks about stroads. We talk about a lot of stuff, legislation that's coming up. We've really formed a community, a knowledge-based community to share information so that we can effectively fight these things as a statewide coalition. So I'm really happy. Our motto is stop the threats and undo the harm, and we mean it. We've presented together in a couple of venues, and we will continue to speak out and support one another so that transportation in Louisiana becomes equitable, because right now it isn't. And our solution is to reconnect communities. We floated our own plan to the USDOT, and you can find the 10-point plan on the Claiborne Avenue website, www.claiborneavenuealliance.com. And in a nutshell, we want to do an analysis of all of the plans that have been floated for Claiborne, conduct a series of workshops, get professionals to come in and help us educate folks, do it through a transparent process so that we come up with a community-driven strategy that allows us to conduct a feasibility or create a feasibility plan that can actually be implemented. And that will include things like zoning, housing supply. We're finding that we have a 40% vacant rate in Treme alone. So we shouldn't have folks on the street. We know some of that is being eaten up by short-term rentals. But if we are successful in capturing funds from reconnecting communities, we can actually do a deep dive and look at what's going on and come up with some solutions that'll work. Also, the merchants who have been struggling on Claiborne have been dying to do some placemaking just to make the place look better, because they lose a lot of business because it's horrible there. And they've cried to the city, and the city says, maybe we'll think about it. And nothing ever happens. So we would like to do some placemaking to begin to change people's impression of the environment that is Claiborne. Also, we want to have broad community engagement and launch a dashboard that shows folks where the money is going, where the project is going, because we all know if you live in New Orleans or if you follow it, we're not the most transparent people here. And that causes a lot of consternation. People live in fear because they never know what's going to happen. So we feel that transparency is a huge part of the need here. And we are very committed to providing transparency if we're able to capture funds to help reconnect Claiborne. One of the things, again, is gentrification. So we need to create land trusts and also do a lot of infill architecture. This is where the land trust is going to come in and be really important, because once the highway is removed, and it will be removed, I'm very committed to that, we're going to capture 60 acres of land that can be developed. So we really need to do that in a manner that allows folks who want to live here to stay here, and folks who want to return home to Treme and the 7th Ward to be able to do so and afford to do so. But also the highway hides the architecture. And you can see we have grand architecture. This is a beautiful brick building that you never see, because the shadow on the brick building is actually the highway. So folks just drive past it if they're on the deck, or just, again, drive past it if they're on the surface road, because you can't see anything but the highway when you're on Claiborne. So we have architecture as grand as this used to be the nursing school for Charity Hospital. It's currently vacant, I believe, but it's probably going to be repurposed as Charity is repurposed. But also you can see on the right, we have very quaint vernacular architecture. And these are actually residences. People live there in the shadow of the highway, just like they do in the 7th Ward. This is actually on Claiborne in Treme. It is right around the corner from my house. I really, frankly, don't understand how they do it, but they do have to live in a closed environment to be comfortable. The noise alone is deafening there. So my partners at LSU School of Health and I quite often measure the noise levels. It hovers during normal hours, not rush hour, at about 83 decibels, which is damaging to the hearing. Across the street where you see the purple and orange houses, it measures at about 73. That's high. That's a lot of noise, a lot of disturbance and disruption to your life. So we need to really, if we want folks to have a great quality of life, we have to remove the highway. And also you'll be able to enjoy the historic building stock that managed to survive the highway. And we want to look at the opportunities, because we feel that we will be successful in doing this. We know that removal of the highway will increase revenue, repair the damage, but also we've got to stop the pitting of neighborhoods against one another, so we can't fight for Claiborne and forget the 9th Ward. We can't fight for New Orleans and forget Violet. We can't fight for, Shreveport and Lafayette and Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is just overrun by highways. That fight hasn't even started yet, but we can't advocate for one and not the other, because we are seeing, as we talk about transportation reform in the state, that we all have to stick together. So we are going to continue to advocate for one another. And finally, we believe that a collaboration with Urban 3 will help set the foundation for a great discussion in New Orleans, because we need to have a really robust discussion about money and finances, and government accountability in the city. But also that will set the foundation for a rebuilding of the corridor. I thank you for the time and look forward to your questions.